Imagine discovering an ancient book that describes heaven, long before most people encountered those ideas in the Bible. 7 heavens stacked above one another, angels of snow and angels of dew, rivers blazing with fire, storehouses filled with stars, every level described, as though someone had walked through the heavens before Genesis ever offered its opening sentence. Genesis tells us, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," and then it moves on. No heavenly blueprint, no detailed architecture, no angels measured by their wings. But another mysterious, forgotten text does something completely different. It gives you a guided journey through heaven, level by level, until the path leads toward the throne of God. Welcome to Soft History Stories, where we explore forgotten texts, ancient mysteries, and stories hidden in history. The book we're entering tonight is known as Second Enoch, and chances are you may never have heard of it. For centuries, the text remained outside the biblical tradition, preserved in monasteries, and copied in a language few can recognize. Yet it may contain one of the most elaborate descriptions of the heavens ever recorded by human hands. Some scholars believe it preserves ancient traditions, possibly predating Christianity. Others argue that it was composed much later and made to sound ancient. There is no agreement. That unresolved question is exactly what makes this story so fascinating. If you enjoy falling asleep while listening to stories that quietly leave your mind wondering, you've come to the right place. So get comfortable, settle in, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read the comments, and it's amazing to see Tokyo waking beneath sunrise, Toronto deep in the night, and London somewhere between, while people everywhere drift towards sleep with the same story. If you'd like more stories like this, follow the show on Spotify through the link in the description. It helps support the channel and makes sure you don't miss another journey into history's forgotten corners. Now return with me to Second Enoch. Picture the scene. A man, not a deity and not an angel, a human being, is carried bodily into the heavens by 2 radiant beings who appear beside his bed during a night. He doesn't die. He isn't struck by lightning or swallowed by a whale, as other biblical figures are. Instead, he rises through clouds and water, passes armies of angels who command the weather, and continues upward into paradise, where the tree of life stands beneath the watch of creatures with 4 faces. Up further still, past a place of darkness and torment, reserved for those who strayed. Higher into realms where the sun and moon are piloted by beings with crowns of fire, where time itself seems to bend and stretch, and higher still until he stands trembling in front of the throne of God. This is Enoch's journey. 7 heavens describe centuries before Dante ever imagined his layered cosmos, before medieval cathedrals ever painted angels on their ceilings. And the strangest part, historians can't agree on when this text was actually written. Some believe it was composed by Jewish writers in the 1st century, before the destruction of the Second Temple, drawing on ancient traditions passed down for generations. Others argue it's a much later Christian composition, maybe medieval, dressed in ancient clothing to seem more authoritative than it really is. The manuscripts we have today survive only in Old Church Slavonic, a language spoken nowhere near where this story supposedly originated. So, how did a text about Jewish mysticism end up preserved exclusively by Slavic monks in Eastern Europe? Nobody has a clean answer. Tonight, we're going to walk through this mystery together. We'll climb through Enoch's 7 heavens, one level at a time. We'll meet the angels who supposedly run the weather, the archangels who guard the throne room, and a being called Sataniel, whose fall from grace looks eerily different from the story you were taught in Sunday school. We'll look at a creation account that reads like Genesis's stranger cousin, and ask the question that's haunted biblical scholars for over a century. Could this forgotten text be older than the book that replaced it? Let's find out. But first, let's understand exactly what 2 Enoch is and why almost nobody's ever heard of it. So, let's start with the basics. What exactly is 2 Enoch? First things first, it's not alone. There's a whole family of texts attributed to this same mysterious figure. And if you're not careful, they'll blur together into one confusing mess. Scholars call this collection the Enochic pseudepigrapha, a fancy term that basically means writings falsely attributed to Enoch, written by unknown authors centuries after the man himself supposedly lived. There's one Enoch, sometimes called the Ethiopic Enoch, because the only complete version survives in an ancient Ethiopian language called Ge'ez. That one's the most famous of the bunch, packed with fallen angels and giants and apocalyptic visions. Then there's 3 Enoch, a much later Hebrew text from Jewish mystical circles, sometimes called the Hebrew Book of Enoch, which describes Enoch transformed into a fiery angel named Metatron. And, sitting right in the middle of these two, chronologically confusing and endlessly debated, is 2 Enoch. 2 Enoch goes by other names too, names that hint at its strange, scattered history. Some call it Slavonic Enoch because every surviving manuscript we have comes from Old Church Slavonic sources copied by monks in Eastern Europe, centuries after the text was supposedly first written. Others call it the Secrets of Enoch, or sometimes the Book of the Secrets of Enoch, a title that fits perfectly once you actually read what's inside. Because this text isn't shy about promising secrets, cosmic secrets, secrets about the structure of heaven itself, secrets about the fall of angels, secrets about the origins of evil, secrets that Enoch supposedly brought back down to earth and passed on to his sons before he vanished from human history a second time. The basic plot is deceptively simple. Enoch, a righteous man living long before the flood, is visited by 2 radiant beings while he sleeps. They take him bodily without dying up through the heavens layer by layer. He witnesses each realm in extraordinary detail. The angels who control weather, the treasury of stars, the paradise where the righteous rest, the darker regions where the wicked suffer, and finally the throne of God itself, blazing at the center of everything. Along the way, God speaks to him directly, revealing the secrets of creation, dictating knowledge that Enoch is instructed to write down in over 300 books. Then Enoch returns to earth for exactly 30 days, teaches his sons everything he learned, and disappears again forever. It's a wild, cosmic, visionary text. And yet, despite all of that, 2 Enoch never made it into the Bible. Not the Jewish canon, not the Catholic canon, not the Protestant canon. It sits outside all of them. Technically pseudepigraph, meaning falsely attributed. Technically apocryphal, meaning hidden or excluded. For most of history, it was virtually unknown outside small circles of Slavic monasteries. Invisible to Western scholars entirely until the 1800s, when researchers finally started translating these obscure Slavonic manuscripts and realized what they were looking at. And that obscurity is exactly why this text remains so mysterious today. We don't know precisely when it was written. We don't know exactly who wrote it or where or why it survived only in a language and region seemingly disconnected from its origins. What we do know is that its description of the heavens is startlingly detailed, startlingly specific, and startlingly early if the oldest theories about its origin are correct, which raises the question we're about to dig into. Just how old is this text really? And what does it mean if it's older than we think? If 2 Enoch is this strange cosmic travelogue through layered heavens, we need to ask a basic question before we go any further. Why Enoch? Out of all the names in the Bible, all the prophets, kings, and visionaries, why did later writers latch onto this one obscure figure and build an entire literary universe around him? Because in the actual book of Genesis, Enoch barely shows up at all. Genesis 5 is one of those chapters most readers skim. It's a genealogy, a long list of X lived this many years, begot Y, and then he died. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalal, Jared. It's the biblical equivalent of scrolling through your phone contacts. Same pattern over and over like a drumbeat. Lived, fathered sons and daughters, and then he died until the pattern suddenly breaks. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he became the father of Methuselah. Thus, all the days of Enoch were 365 years Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him. That's it. 4 verses. No details, no explanation, no. And then he died. Just he walked with God, and then he was gone. To ancient readers, that little rupture in the rhythm was like a flashing neon sign. Everybody else dies. Enoch doesn't. Everyone else just lives and fathers children. Enoch walks with God. What does that mean? Where did he go? What did he see? Why him? The text doesn't say. It leaves this gaping narrative hole right in the middle of the pre-flood story. And that silence turned Enoch into a magnet. The phrase walked with God is surprisingly loaded. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, walking with God is about intimate ongoing relationship, moral alignment, obedience at a deep daily level. It's not just he believed in God, it's his whole life moved in step with the divine. But with Enoch, Genesis never spells out what that looked like. No laws, no commandments, no epic tests of faith, just the verdict. And then God took him. Took him where? How? Was it death by another name or something else entirely? The Hebrew is ambiguous enough that later readers had options. Maybe Enoch was snatched away alive, like a prototype of the prophet Elijah's fiery chariot. Maybe he crossed some boundary between earth and heaven without passing through ordinary death at all. Once you start asking those questions, you can see why Enoch became a perfect canvas for imagination. By the time we get to the Second Temple period, roughly the last few centuries before the Common Era, Jewish writers are obsessed with big cosmic questions. How does heaven work? Why is there evil in the world? What really happened before the flood? What's going to happen at the end of days? They're producing apocalyptic literature, visionary journeys, elaborate angologies, speculative cosmologies. And here, sitting quietly in Genesis, is a man who apparently walked with God and bypassed death. If anybody was going to know how the cosmos really operates, it would be him. That's how the Enoch tradition is born, not out of thin air, but out of a few cryptic words that demand to be filled in. The earliest major expression of that tradition is what we call one Enoch, or Ethiopic Enoch. There, Enoch is no longer just a name in a genealogy. He becomes the central character in a sprawling multi-art work. He's the one who watches the angels descend, take human wives, teach forbidden knowledge, and father the giant Nephilim. He's sent as a mediator to these rebellious watchers carrying divine judgment. He travels through cosmic regions, sees the storehouses of the winds and the paths of the sun and moon, witnesses the place of punishment for fallen angels, and hears secrets about the coming judgment of the world. In the Book of Jubilees, another Second Temple text that retells and expands Genesis, Enoch gets a different emphasis. There he's framed as the first person to learn writing, to study heavenly tablets, to keep meticulous records of years and seasons. He becomes the primordial scribe, the keeper of calendars, the one who knows the correct rhythm of sacred time, where one Enoch leans into visions and judgment. Jubilees leans into scribal wisdom and cosmic order. Much later, in 3 Enoch, emerging from Jewish mystical circles many centuries after the Second Temple was destroyed, Enoch completes his transformation. He's not just a human visitor to heaven anymore. He becomes the angel Metatron, the lesser YHW, a towering fiery being seated on a throne second only to God's. The scribal theme is still there. Metatron is sometimes portrayed as God's celestial secretary, the one who records everything. But now, Enoch's humanity has been almost entirely transfigured into pure angelic power. Seen together, these works form what scholars call the Enochic tradition or Enochic literature, a cluster of texts that all look back to those 4 puzzling verses in Genesis and ask what really happened when God took Enoch. Each text answers differently. Visionary judge of angels, primordial calendar keeper, transformed archangel. But they all agree on the core idea. Enoch is the human who crossed the line, saw what others couldn't, and came back, at least for a moment, with knowledge not meant for ordinary mortals. Why him? Part of the answer lies in his timing. In Genesis, Enoch lives in the generations leading up to the flood. That shadowy, morally ambiguous era where the sons of God and daughters of men mingle. Violence fills the earth, and something goes so catastrophically wrong that God decides to reset the world. If you want a narrator who can explain what went wrong before Noah, who can tell you what the angels did, why judgment was necessary, and what lies beyond the visible sky, you pick someone from that lineal period. Enoch stands between worlds in every sense, between Adam and Noah in the genealogy, between life and death in his departure, between earth and heaven in his walking with God. That in-betweenness made him uniquely qualified in the imagination of later authors to receive heavenly secrets. Not an angel by nature, not a prophet embedded in the later history of Israel, but a primordial human ancestor who somehow broke through the normal boundaries of human experience. So when a later writer wanted to explore the architecture of the cosmos, or explain the origin of evil, or map out the hidden mechanics of time and judgment, attributing their work to Enoch made a certain kind of sense. Who else would know? Who else could plausibly claim to have been there? To have walked with God before the flood? To have been taken and shown the machinery behind the curtain? This is the world that 2 Enoch steps into. It doesn't invent the idea of Enoch as visionary or scribe. It inherits a character already thick with meaning. The man who never died, the walker with God, the ancestor who vanished. What 2 Enoch does next is take that inherited Enoch and push him even further deeper into the heavens, deeper into the secrets of creation, and deeper into the role of cosmic storyteller. To see how radical that expansion really is, we have to look at where 2 Enoch came from, how it survived, and why its particular version of Enoch's journey ended up preserved in an unexpected corner of the world. When modern scholars went looking for that unexpected corner, they didn't start in Jerusalem or in the deserts of Egypt or in some ancient synagogue library. They found 2 Enoch in Slavonic, not Hebrew, not Greek, not even Latin, Old Church Slavonic, the liturgical language of medieval Eastern Christianity. That alone would be weird enough, but the way it happened makes the story even stranger. In the late 19th century, Russian scholars were combing through manuscript collections in church libraries and monasteries. These were not glamorous Indiana Jones-style expeditions. Think drafty archives, crumbling bindings, and long days copying texts by hand. In 1880, a Russian scholar named Matvey Sokolov was working with a manuscript from the Chudov monastery in Moscow. In the middle of a collection of edifying religious writings, he noticed something that did not fit the usual pattern. It was a long narrative in Slavonic attributed to Enoch the 7th from Adam. It described a heavenly ascent, multiple layers of heaven, angelic hosts, visions of creation, cosmic secrets. Sokolov realized he was looking at something that, as far as anyone knew, had never been printed, never been translated, never been studied in the West. He published the text in Russian in 1899 and again with more material in 1910. He called it the Book of the Secrets of Enoch. From that point on, the text acquired a new identity in scholarship to Enoch. First Enoch was the Ethiopic collection already known from Geer's manuscripts. This one, preserved in Slavonic, became the second Book of Enoch to distinguish it from the earlier, better attested work. But the real global debut came when Western scholars started paying attention. Enter R.H. Charles, the early 20th century Irish scholar who, more than almost anyone else, shaped how modern readers encounter ancient Jewish apocalypses. Charles was already famous for his editions of 1 Enoch, Jubilees, and other pseudepigrapha. When he got hold of Sokolov's material and other Slavonic witnesses, he knew he was dealing with a missing piece of the Enochic puzzle. In 1896 and 1897, Charles wrote the first major English-language studies introducing 2 Enoch to a wider academic audience. He argued that beneath the medieval Slavonic text, there lay a much older Jewish work originally composed in Greek sometime in the late Second Temple period. In his 1913 edition and translation, he tried to reconstruct that lost Greek as far as the evidence would allow. Suddenly, A text that had been quietly sleeping in Russian monastic collections was being discussed in German, English, French. It was pulled into conversations about apocalyptic Judaism, early Christianity, and the wider Enochic tradition. If Charles was right, this was not some medieval fantasy. It was a witness, albeit an indirect one, to Jewish thought, just before or around the time of Jesus. But there was a problem, actually, several. First, every single manuscript of 2 Enoch we possess is in Slavonic, and they're all medieval. The earliest copies seem to date to around the 14th century. Some are as late as the 18th century. There is no physical Hebrew fragment from Qumran, no Greek papyrus, not even a later Greek codex, just a cluster of Slavonic church manuscripts from Russia and the Balkans, copied by Christian scribes more than 1,000 years after the Second Temple period. Second, those Slavonic manuscripts don't all agree. Scholars quickly realize there are 2 main forms of the text, usually called the longer recension and the shorter recension. The longer recension contains extended speeches, additional ethical instructions, more detailed descriptions of Enoch's revelations, sometimes full paragraphs of material absent from the shorter form. The shorter recension is more compressed. Scenes move faster, transitions are rougher, certain elaborations simply aren't there. So, which one is closer to whatever the original might have been? For a long time, many scholars favored the longer recension. It felt more complete, more polished, more like what one would expect from an elaborate apocalyptic revelation. Charles leaned this way, treating the shorter text as an abridgment. More recent work has been cautious, sometimes leaning in the opposite direction. Some argue that scribes often expand, harmonize, and improve texts as they copy them, adding clarifications, extra sermons, and theological glosses. On that logic, the shorter ascension might preserve an earlier, less edited core, while the longer ascension bears the marks of centuries of Christian transmission and embellishment. But the evidence is messy. There are places where the longer text seems to preserve coherent narrative that the shorter text chops awkwardly, as if by accidental omission. There are other places where the longer text smells like secondary expansion, full of phrases and concerns that look at home in medieval Slavonic piety. Without a Greek or Hebrew-based text to compare against, we're left triangulating between variant Slavonic copies, trying to peer through layers of translation and redaction to glimpse a hypothetical original. This is where the manuscript gap becomes more than a technical inconvenience. It becomes the heart of the debate. If 2 Enoch really was written by a Jewish author in Greek before 70 CE, then the Slavonic text is like an echo of an echo, a medieval Slavic mirror reflecting a late antique Greek translation of a Second Temple Jewish composition. Every stage introduces potential distortions, mistranslations, doctrinal tweaks, expansions, omissions. On the other hand, if significant parts of 2 Enoch only took shape in a Christian environment, perhaps even in the Slavic world itself, then the lack of earlier witnesses isn't a gap to be bridged. It's a clue. It would mean that what looks like ancient Enochic lore might in fact be late, retrofitted into the Enoch tradition by Christian scribes who loved apocalyptic narratives and were happy to write new ones under his name. Most scholars today land somewhere in between. Many think there is an authentic Jewish core, probably originally in Greek, from the 1st centuries BC or CE, especially in the heavenly journey and creation material. Around that core, layers of Christian editing and perhaps outright composition seem to have accumulated, especially in the moral exhortations and final sections. But nobody can point to a single physical manuscript that proves where the line lies. The text we can actually read exists only as a family of medieval Slavonic copies, some long, some short, all Christian. And that's the irony. If 2 Enoch really does preserve some of the earliest, wildest speculations about the structure of the heavens and the mysteries of creation, if it really reaches back toward the same world that produced 1 Enoch and Jubilees, then those ancient voices survived not in the scrolls of Qumran or in the libraries of Alexandria, but in Slavic monasteries copied by monks who prayed in a language Enoch's original author could never have imagined. An allegedly primeval revelation framed as coming from the very dawn of human history now comes to us dressed in the script and syntax of the Middle Ages. That tension between the claim to primordial antiquity and the reality of late fragile manuscripts hangs over every attempt to read to Enoch. It doesn't make the text worthless. If anything, it makes it more intriguing because when we turn to its actual contents, its layered heavens, its creation account, its figure of Satanale, we're always asking two questions at once. What is this text saying? And how far back does that voice really go? So, who actually wrote this thing, and when? If you open a modern study of 2 Enoch, you pretty much walk into an argument that's been going on for more than a century. At the center of it is a deceptively simple question with two big, competing answers. On one side, you have scholars who say, this is basically a Jewish work from the 1st century CE, maybe written in Greek, maybe in Egypt, maybe in the orbit of Alexandria. In this view, the Slavonic manuscripts are like late snow covering a much older mountain. On the other side, you have those who argue, no, a lot of what we're reading may be much younger, maybe a late antique Christian composition, even a Byzantine or Slavic creation that's only loosely connected to Second Temple Judaism. In that scenario, there might not be a towering mountain under the snow at all, just a hill that Christians themselves piled up over time. Let's start with the early Jewish theory, because historically that's been the dominant one. The argument usually begins by pointing to the way to Enoch talks about the temple, sacrifice, and priesthood. In several passages, Enoch gives instructions to his sons about sacrificial worship, purity, and priestly conduct. And the tone sounds like the temple in Jerusalem is still standing, still central, still a live reality. There's no mourning over its destruction, no attempt to say, we used to do it this way before the catastrophe. If that impression is right, it would place the original composition sometime before 70 CE, before the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. That already puts us deep in the Second Temple period, in the same general era as 1 Enoch's later parts Jubilees and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then there's the philosophical flavor. Some parts of 2 Enoch, especially in the creation and cosmological sections, feel surprisingly at home in the world of Hellenistic Jewish thought. The way it talks about the structure of the heavens, the ordered layers of reality, even some of the language about God's ineffability and transcendence. These have led scholars to see parallels with Philo of Alexandria, the great Jewish philosopher writing in Greek in the early century. Philo loves talking about the cosmos as a carefully structured, layered reality. He blends biblical themes with Platonic and Stoic concepts. When 2 Enoch lays out a multi-tiered heaven populated with different ranks of angels arranged in a sharply hierarchical order, and then ties that into moral exhortations and speculation about creation. Some readers hear that same Alexandrian accent. Add to this the fact that other Enochic materials were clearly circulating in Greek in Egypt, and one plausible picture emerges: a Jewish author or circle of authors steeped in both the Enoch tradition and Greek philosophy, composing a new apocalypse in Greek, somewhere in the 1st century CE, maybe in or around Alexandria. That Greek text is then copied, translated, and eventually, centuries later, rendered into Slavonic. But then you hit the brakes because all of this rests on reconstruction. We don't have that Greek text. We don't have a single scrap of 2 Enoch from Qumran. And Qumran, remember, is packed with Enochic literature. 1 Enoch, Jubilees, Kendrical fragments, apocalyptic visions, all kinds of material that look like cousins to what we find in 2 Enoch. If 2 Enoch was really a major Jewish apocalypse from the same era, why don't we see even a trace of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Some scholars answer, maybe the Qumran community simply didn't know it or didn't like it, or their copies didn't survive. That's possible. The desert preserved a lot, but not everything. Others flip the logic around. They say the absence at Qumran is a warning sign. It suggests that 2 Enoch, at least in the form we know it, may not belong to that earlier stratum of Enochic material at all. Instead, It might come from a later post-70 CE world, or even from a Christian environment, where people were retrofitting Jewish apocalyptic motifs to new theological concerns. There are also hints inside the text that feel very at home in Christian or Byzantine thought. Some manuscript forms of 2 Enoch contain strikingly Christian elements, explicit references to the Lord Jesus, or Trinitarian-sounding formulas or homiletic passages that read like Orthodox sermons. These obviously aren't first-century Jewish. They are almost universally treated as secondary additions by Christian scribes. But once you admit that Christian scribes have been adding and altering material, another question opens up. How far did that process go? Did they just sprinkle in a few Christological glosses on top of a mostly intact Jewish core? Or did they reshape whole sections, rewriting ethical instructions to reflect Christian morality, reworking prayers and doxologies, adding aesthetic ideals, and intensifying other worldly rewards and punishments in ways that match medieval monastic spirituality? Some scholars argue for a relatively conservative Christian redaction. The core cosmology, heavenly tour, and creation narrative are Jewish. Most of the explicit Christianity sits on the surface, easy to peel off. Others think Christian influence runs far deeper, and that the very way the text talks about repentance, almsgiving, and judgment already bears the fingerprints of a Christian homiletic context. There's even a minority position that suggests something more radical, that what we call 2 Enoch might be primarily a Christian-era composition, perhaps produced in Greek, or even directly in Slavic drawing, on older Enoic motifs, but not actually translating a single fixed Jewish original. In that view, the connections to Foe are echoes of a shared intellectual environment, rather than proof of direct influence. And the Jewish core is more of a conceptual ancestor than a recoverable text. So where does Qumran come back into this? 2. Enoch shares some obsessions with the Dead Sea Scrolls community. Calendars, purity, priestly status, a highly structured cosmos full of angels and spirits. That has tempted some researchers to link 2 Enoch to circles similar to, or at least influenced by, the same currents that produced the Qumran texts. The idea is not that 2 Enoch came from Qumran, but that it emerged from a broader, Enoch-friendly apocalyptic priestly milieu in late Second Temple Judaism. Yet without a single physical fragment, those connections remain hypothetical. Stylistic parallels, shared interests, overlapping themes. These can maps of ideas, but they don't prove that 2 Enoch as we have it actually stood on a shelf in any Essene library. Why does all of this matter beyond academic turf wars? Because how you date and source to Enoch fundamentally changes what you think you're hearing when it talks about the heavens and creation. If you believe you're listening to a Jewish writer from the 1st century working in Greek, perhaps in Alexandrian circles, then 2 Enoch becomes a precious window into how some Jews were imagining the cosmos right around the time of Jesus and Paul, parallel to Philo, adjacent to Qumran. Standing in the same intellectual weather as early Christianity but not yet Christian itself. In that case, its multi-layered heavens, its account of creation, its figure of Satan, its talk of time and the 8th day, are all data points for reconstructing Second Temple cosmology, an alternative map of the universe that may lie behind or alongside the cosmos presupposed in Genesis and the New Testament. If, on the other hand, you think large portions of 2 Enoch are the product of later Christian imagination, then those same cosmological passages look different. They're no longer straightforward evidence of pre-70 Jewish thought. They become part of a Christian mystical and homiletic tradition that loved to elaborate on heaven's architecture, to moralize the skies, to turn cosmic geography into sermons about repentance, charity, and judgment. In that reading, the text still preserves ancient motifs, but they're filtered through centuries of theological reinterpretation. The heavens you're touring aren't just Second Temple heavens. They're Byzantine heavens, too. Either way, the debate pushes us to read carefully. Every time 2 Enoch describes a heaven, an angelic rank, a cosmic storehouse of snow or fire, we have to ask, is this echoing an older Jewish vision standing shoulder to shoulder with 1 Enoch and Jubilees? Or Is it already the product of a Christian scribe imagining the cosmos from a monastery window somewhere in medieval Slavia? We may never pin the answer down with certainty, but keeping the question alive shapes how we hear the text and how we weigh its claims when it starts leading Enoch, step by step, through the layered structure of the universe. So, let's zoom in on what the text actually does with all of that. To Enoch doesn't drop you straight into the heavens. It starts on the ground in Enoch's ordinary human life. He's not yet the cosmic sage, not yet the angelic scribe. He's a patriarch living among his family in a world that still looks more or less like the world of Genesis 5. Then everything ruptures. Two enormous men shining like the sun suddenly appear at his house. In some manuscripts, they're explicitly called angels. Their faces blaze, their eyes burn, their clothes are whiter than anything on earth. They tell Enoch his time on this world is basically over. God has summoned him. He has to leave his home, his wife, his children, and come up. That visitation is the ignition point. From there, the narrative becomes a kind of extended departure scene. Enoch is given a short window of time before he's taken away for good. And this is where 2 Enoch builds its framing device, the thing that holds the whole book together. Enoch calls his sons and his broader household. He knows they're not coming with him. The divide between earth and heaven is about to open, and he will be on the other side. So he starts dictating ethical commands, cosmological explanations, warnings about judgment, descriptions of the worlds above. In some recent, he explicitly orders them to write everything down to preserve his words in books. The whole text, in other words, presents itself as Enoch's last will and testament to his descendants, composed in the shadow of his imminent removal from the earth. Everything that follows, the ascent, the tour of the heavens, the creation account, the revelations about time and Satanale and the future, is wrapped in that narrative situation. An old patriarch standing on the threshold, trying to compress everything he has learned into a small bundle of words before the angels come back. That's important because it means the cosmology isn't just abstract speculation. It's tied directly to exaltation. When Enoch sees something in heaven, a storehouse, a choir of angels, a place of punishment, he will later turn to his sons and say, "This is why you must live like this, avoid that, pursue this kind of righteousness." The vertical journey becomes a moral argument. Now, structurally, the heart of that journey is simple but radical. 10 heavens. Not one vague heaven high above. Not just heaven and earth, but a carefully layered vertical universe, stacked like floors in a cosmic tower. Each heaven has its own function, its own inhabitants, its own atmosphere. Enoch is escorted through them step by his angelic guides, moving higher and higher until he reaches the very presence of God. This is very different from the more compressed assumptions you often get if you just read the Hebrew Bible on its own terms. Genesis, Psalms, Isaiah, they talk about the heavens and the heaven of heavens, about God's dwelling on high, about the firmament holding back the waters, but the architecture isn't spelled out in detail. The cosmos feels 2 or 3 layered underworld below, earth in the middle, heaven above, with some suggestion of additional heights, but no clear floor plan. To Enoch, by contrast, hands you something like a blueprint. First heaven, second heaven, third, all the way up to the tent. It systematizes what earlier texts left fluid. It turns vague above into a mapped territory. And that's one reason scholars care about it so much. This is one of the clearest, most elaborate examples of a multi-heaven Jewish or Christian cosmology we possess. Standing somewhere on the spectrum between the third heaven Paul mentions into Corinthians and the highly layered heavens of later mystical traditions. As Enoch ascends, each heaven reveals a different facet of the divine order. In the lower levels, you meet the machinery of weather and time, the angels who manage clouds and snow, and the cycles of day and night. A little higher, you hit stark moral geography, a region of punishment, a paradise of rest, the destinies of souls drawn in sharp relief. Move further, and the sun and moon themselves appear, not as mindless lights, but as obedient servants, following prescribed courses. Higher still, the drama changes. You start seeing the watchers, the fallen beings chained in expectation of judgment, and the loyal orders of angels whose whole existence is praise, intercession, guardianship. At the summit, the narrative slows almost to a halt, as Enoch enters the realm of archangels, and finally, the ineffable throne. The place where God himself appears in a blaze of light, surrounded by countless angelic choirs. And beyond, even the seventh heaven, where many Jewish texts would stop. 2. Enoch keeps climbing, describing 8th, 9th, and 10th levels that push the imagination to its limit, where creation, time, and divine wisdom themselves are contemplated. All of this is framed as something Enoch must see now so he can speak later. He goes up as an ordinary human, guided by angels, baffled and terrified, asking questions. He comes down as a teacher, laying out a structured universe for his sons, 10 heavens arranged in a moral and liturgical hierarchy, every layer charged with ethical meaning. In the sections that follow, we're going to slow that ascent down. We'll walk heaven by heaven from the 1st to the 10th, tracing what 2 Enoch claims is waiting above the clouds, the weather angles and storehouses in the lower realms, the paradises and prisons of souls, the circuits of sun and moon, the ranks of watchers and archangels, and finally, the unimaginable throne room itself, and the strange regions that lie even beyond it. The ascent starts small when the angels finally take Enoch up. They don't rocket him straight to the throne room. They bring him to the lowest level of the structure. He's just been told about the first heaven, and what he sees there is not choirs of seraphim or souls of the righteous. It's weather too. Enoch describes the first heaven as the place where the basic machinery of the sky is kept. In some recensions, Enoch says he saw the great sea of waters suspended above, and under it, the movements of the clouds and the currents of air. It's the space just above the visible world, the layer you and I think of when we look up and see a blue vault and drifting clouds. But for Enoch, that familiar sky is now revealed as an enormous storage system. Immediately he meets guardians right at the threshold. 2 Enoch places angels set over the gate of this first heaven. They're not just decorative. Their job is to control what passes between heaven and earth. Enoch is escorted past very terrible angelic beings who in some versions are described as watching the treasuries of the waters. There is already a sense of regulation of cosmic border control. Creation doesn't just happen, it's managed. Then, the text starts opening doors. Enoch is shown the storehouses or treasuries of the elements that shape human life. There are chambers where clouds are kept until they are sent out. There are repositories of snow and ice, of frost and cold winds. There are places where hail is stored, locked up until the appointed time. In some manuscripts, these treasuries are literally described as rooms filled and sealed, awaiting a command. To an ancient reader, this isn't quaint meteorology, it's theology. The idea is that nothing about the weather is random. Every storm, every drought-breaking rain, every killing frost comes from somewhere, and that somewhere is populated and ordered to Enoch, turns the sky into a vast celestial warehouse complex. And Enoch is getting a behind-the-scenes tour. Inside this system, angels are everywhere. The text doesn't just say that God made clouds and snow, it says God appointed angels over them. There are angelic beings whose task is to gather clouds from the storehouses and spread them out over the earth. Others open the treasury of snow or unleash frost. Winds are not faceless forces, they're carried and directed by spirits assigned to the 4 corners of the world. In some descriptions, these angels are arranged almost like departments in a bureaucracy. There are those responsible for the seasons and years and the rivers and the sea, and those specifically over the thunder and lightning. Lightning is not a blind discharge, it is an arrow fired on command. Thunder is a voice that moves when told to move, and all of it is accountable upward. 2. Enoch stresses that none of these angels act on their own initiative. They stand and wait, not departing at all from their service until God issues the word. Only then do they open the treasury of hail, release the winds, pour out rain on a land, or hold it back. The first heaven is a picture of cosmic obedience. The weather in this vision is liturgy. The atmosphere is a choir of elements responding in perfect timing. If that sounds strange, it's also familiar. The Hebrew Bible already hints at this kind of structure. Genesis 1 talks about waters above the firmament and waters below. Psalms mentions God making the clouds his chariot and walking on the wings of the wind. Job in particular is full of storehouse imagery. Job 38 has God say, "Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or seen the storehouses of the hail, which I reserve for times of trouble?" It also speaks of paths for the thunderstorm, channels for the rain, ordinances of the heavens. 2. Enoch takes that language and literalizes it, where Job uses poetic questions to humble a human listener. Have you seen these hidden places? Of course you haven't. To Enoch's whole premise is that Enoch he actually walks among the very storehouses Job only heard about. The metaphor becomes map. The rhetorical image turns into architectural detail. This is one way you can see two Enoch standing inside an older Near Eastern cosmology, but giving it a particular, almost technical spin. Ancient peoples around Israel often imagined a layered sky with waters above, gates of heaven, and divine beings regulating rain and storm. You can see versions of this in Mesopotamian and Canaanite traditions where gods or their attendants open sluices in the heavens to bring floods or withhold rain as punishment. 2. Enoch's first heaven belongs to that same mental world. The heavens are not empty space, but stack zones full of water, wind, and spirits. What makes 2 Enoch distinctive is the systematization. Genesis 1 mentions the firmament in a few lines and moves on. It never pauses to unpack what exactly is up there, who might be managing it, or how it all fits together. You get a compressed sketch. God separates waters, places lights, calls it good. That's it. 2. Enoch slows the camera way down. It lingers on the first layer above the earth, listing out categories of weather phenomena and assigning each one a location and a staff. Snow, frost, dew, rain, hail, wind, each gets a treasury. Each treasury has guardians. Each guardian reports to God. The result is vivid and weirdly specific. You can almost imagine Enoch being ushered from one chamber to another, his guide explaining, "This is where the snow waits for winter. This is where storms are stored for days of judgment." And remember the narrative frame. All of this is something Enoch is going to take back to his sons. He isn't shown the first heaven just so he can say the sky is pretty. He's being taught that the world his descendants live in is saturated with order. When rain falls on their fields, that's not chance, it's a decision. When drought comes, it's not just bad luck. It's a sign that the treasuries have been held shut. Behind every cloud is an angel. Behind every angel, a command. So, the ascent begins at the most ordinary level imaginable, the weather you experience every day, and flips it inside out. Enoch's first step into heaven doesn't show him something utterly alien. It shows him what he already knew, but reinterpreted as part of a layered, populated cosmos. Only after he understands that the simplest things, clouds, rain, wind, are already tied to heavenly governance, is he ready to move higher into realms where the fates of souls, the paths of the sun and moon, and the destinies of angels themselves are laid out with the same unsettling precision. The next step up is a shock. If the first heaven is all about ordered weather and obedient angels, the second heaven feels like somebody turned off the lights. Into Enoch, when Enoch is lifted there, he doesn't find more storehouses or gentle administrators of snow and wind. He finds a prison. The text says, "This realm is in darkness and gloom, a place where no human lives and no ordinary angel seems to roam freely." Here, Enoch sees beings who, in many manuscripts, are explicitly described as fallen. These are angels who did not keep their appointed order, who abandoned the high heaven and were cast down, but not all the way to earth. They're suspended in the in-between, bound in chains, awaiting the last judgment. It's an unsettling image. The second heaven is not hell. It's not the lake of fire. It's a holding facility, a cosmic remand prison for celestial rebels. Some versions of 2 Enoch stress their misery. Enoch sees them hanging, darkened, unable to raise their eyes to heaven. They beg him to intercede, to speak to God on their behalf. They ask for mercy, for some kind of reprieve. Enoch, in turn, is told by his angelic guide that their sentence is already fixed. They are those who turned away from the Lord, and they will stay there until the final judgment, when their fate will be sealed. This is where 2 Enoch brushes up against other apocalyptic traditions. You can hear echoes of the Watchers from 1 Enoch. The angels who descended, took human wives, taught forbidden knowledge, and were imprisoned in the valleys of the earth until the great day. You can hear hints of 2 Peter and Jude in the New Testament, which talk about angels being kept in chains of gloomy darkness until judgment. The second heaven in 2 Enoch sits right in that same imaginative space, a reserved area in the cosmos where divine justice is already underway, but not yet complete. And notice the placement, right after the realm of weather, and before the realm of paradise to Enoch, inserts a zone of punishment, but specifically for angels. Human fate hasn't come into view yet. Before Enoch sees where the righteous and wicked among mortals will end up, he is made to walk past the consequences for heavenly beings who broke rank. It's a warning built into the architecture. Even spirits can fall, and when they do, there is a place for them. Then the atmosphere changes again. From that darkness, Enoch is carried into the third heaven, and suddenly the descriptions brighten. Here the text slows down and starts to sound almost lush. The third heaven in 2 Enoch is where paradise is kept. Paradise is not some vague cloud-like happiness, it's a garden. Enoch says he saw a place between corruptibility and incorruptibility, a land of astonishing beauty filled with every kind of good tree bearing sweet fruit in endless variety. There are blooming plants, fragrant spices, flowing fountains, rivers that never dry up. The air seems to be alive with life that never withers. The righteous dead, according to many readings of the text, are destined to live here after judgment, eating from trees that don't rot, drinking from streams that never run foul. At the center of this garden is something even more striking: the tree of life. 2. Enoch leans into this image. The tree of life reaches up to the very third heaven, its roots in paradise, its crown touching the edge of the divine realm. Its fragrance is described as pouring out over the whole earth. Its fruit is said to be beyond description, giving life and healing. Anyone who eats from it, the text implies, will be like the angels, immune to death and corruption. And this tree is not unguarded. Around the tree of life, Enoch sees angels stationed like an honor guard. Some manuscripts describe fiery beings. Others emphasize their terrible and mighty appearance. Their job is clear: to protect the tree until the appointed time, so that only those whom God allows can approach and partake. It's difficult not to hear an echo of Genesis here. The cherubim with a flaming sword guarding the way to the tree after Adam and Eve are expelled. 2. Enoch seems to be inhabiting that same story world, but placing the tree not at the edge of an earthly garden, but firmly in a heavenly one. Yet even here in this radiant paradise, to Enoch doesn't let you relax completely, because the third heaven, like a coin, has another side. After describing the garden of the righteous, the text abruptly turns and says that on the north side, or opposite this place, is something else entirely, a region of horrific torment prepared for sinners. It's still the third heaven, but a different district. Here Enoch sees souls suffering, some hanging, some being burned, some frozen, punished according to their deeds. In some recensions, murderers, adulterers, and those who corrupt justice are singled out, each group undergoing a fitting, almost symbolic punishment. So the third heaven is a split realm. Paradise, with the tree of life and its angels on one side, a proto-hell, a place of retribution, on the other. This dual structure feels familiar to later readers. Later, Christian tradition will develop heavens of bliss and hells of torment as sharply separated destinations. But 2. Enoch's third heaven isn't quite that. It places reward and punishment adjacent, almost within sight of each other, divided but coordinated under the same cosmic level. You can think of it as an early experiment in mapping moral outcomes directly onto the fabric of the universe. Some scholars see in this a bridge between older Jewish ideas of Sheol, the shadowy underworld where all the dead go, and the more sharply differentiated heaven-hell schemes that appear in Christian and later Jewish mystical literature. 2. Enoch doesn't just hint that God will judge. It locates the results of that judgment spatially with vivid, almost topographical detail. And those details travel. If you read later apocalypses, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Apocalypse of Paul, the Latin vision of Tyndale, you start to see the same kind of tour, a righteous guide, a visionary taken through zones of reward and zones of punishment, specific sins matched with tailored torments, trees of life and rivers of fire laid out in sequence. 2 Enoch is one of the early texts that sketches that blueprint, where the later authors had it directly in hand or were drawing from a shared pool of imagery. The family resemblance is hard to miss. Underneath all this architecture is a moral argument. The second and third heavens aren't just cosmic sightseeing, they're sermons in spatial form. The imprisoned angels in darkness say rebellion even in heaven has consequences, and those consequences can be delayed but not cancelled. The divided third heaven says human choices matter and their results are not ephemeral. They are written into the layout of reality itself. There is a place for faithfulness and a place for treachery. There is a tree that heals and a realm that burns. Eschatology, the teaching about last things, isn't delivered here as a set of abstract doctrines. It's staged as a journey. Enoch walks through the future destinies of angels and humans as if he's touring neighborhoods. When he comes back down to earth, he's supposed to tell his children, "This is what lies above you. This is what your actions are aligning you with even now." By the time he leaves the third heaven, the pattern is becoming clear. The higher Enoch goes, the more the heavens reveal themselves as a moral map. Weather is ordered, angels are judged, humans are sorted. And he hasn't even reached the realms where the sun, moon, and the infamous watchers are stationed, waiting to show him that even time and celestial bodies are woven into this same strange ordered drama. In the fourth heaven, the moral map suddenly looks like a clock. When Enoch is lifted there, he doesn't first see choirs of angels or thrones of glory. He's shown machinery, celestial infrastructure, the place where, in 2 Enoch's imagination, time itself is kept on track. This is where the courses of the sun and moon are laid out in almost obsessive detail. The text slows down and starts doing something that sounds to modern ears like a mashup of astronomy, calendar theory, and liturgy. Enoch is told about portals in heaven through which the sun rises and sets. He's given numbers, how many days it travels in one gate before shifting to another, how its path changes across the year, how light and darkness trade places in precise proportions. The sun is not just a big fiery ball in the sky. It's a disciplined servant, escorted by angels moving on fixed tracks. And those tracks matter. 2 Enoch describes how the length of days and nights changes, how the sun's movement creates seasons, how its chariot is guided so it never deviates from the command it's been given. In some recensions, Enoch is told about the sun's storehouse of light, how it dispenses heat and brightness according to a divinely set schedule. The impression is clear. What we experience as ordinary sunrise and sunset are actually the visible edge of an invisible, carefully regulated system in the fourth heaven. The moon gets its own treatment. Enoch is shown its phases, told why it waxes and wanes, how many days it takes to complete its circuit, how its light is borrowed and regulated. The moon too has gates, courses, and angelic guardians. Its apparent changeability on earth is, from the fourth heaven's perspective, just another pattern in a larger timetable. Underneath all the numbers is a calendar. Scholars have long noticed that the sun and moon material in 2 Enoch looks like it's participating in the same world as the calendar schemes in 1 Enoch Jubilees and the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not identical. 2 Enoch survives in Slavonic with layers of editing, but the instinct is the same, to turn the heavens into a cosmic schedule that tells you when to mark festivals, Sabbaths, and sacred years. Some passages hint at a 364 days pattern with weeks and seasons neatly arranged. a scheme that shows up in other Second Temple texts as an ideal priestly calendar. Other bits seem to reflect later reworking or harmonization with lunar systems. The result is a kind of hybrid, an elaborate, sometimes confusing, but deeply intentional attempt to embed a sacred calendar into the architecture of the universe. From 2 Enoch's viewpoint, this isn't abstract science, it's theology in numbers. To know the courses of the sun and moon is to know how God orders history. The angels in the fourth heaven are effectively timekeepers. They make sure the liturgical year doesn't drift, that appointed times for worship line up with the movements of the sky. Time is not random, it's a liturgy the cosmos is constantly performing. And then, just as you've gotten used to heavenly orreries and calendars, Enoch is taken higher into a realm where the ticking of the cosmic clock is overshadowed by something more tragic. The fifth heaven is where he meets the Gregorii. Gregorii is a transliteration of a word meaning watchers. And if you know 1 Enoch or Genesis 6, your ears prick up immediately. In those texts, the watchers are the angels who watched over the world, but also watched human women descended, took wives, fathered giants, and taught forbidden knowledge, mythology, sorcery, cosmetics, warfare. Their fall becomes one of the foundational myths of angelic rebellion in early Jewish literature. 2. Enoch picks up that thread, but gives it a different twist. In the fifth heaven, Enoch finds multitudes of mighty angels who look at first simply inactive. They're not praising, they're not singing. They're sitting there silent with downcast faces. When Enoch asks his angelic guide what's going on, he's told, "These are the Gregorii who turned aside from the Lord, who were supposed to stand before God, but fell from their station." Some recensions are explicit. A portion of them descended in the days before the flood, taking human wives, corrupting the earth. Others emphasize that many of them still remained in heaven, but became paralyzed by the rebellion of their comrades, unable to resume praise. The fifth heaven in 2 Enoch is not a fiery prison like the second. It's more like a devastated battalion sitting in stunned grief over its own betrayal. There is punishment, though, and it's internal, where the fallen angels in the second heaven are chained in darkness. The Gregorii and the fifth are imprisoned in their own silence. Their vocation was to be watchers, alert, praising, mediating. But now they just stare downward, too ashamed or too hardened to lift their eyes. It's a haunting image, an entire order of angels spiritually stuck, the praise vacuum where they should be echoing through the level of heaven that once depended on their songs. 2. Enoch quietly links this to the broader Enochic mythology. The same watcher story that in 1 Enoch explains the origins of giants, violence, and illicit knowledge now has architectural consequences. Some of the rebels are locked in gloom between the first and third heavens. Others haunt the fifth, half fallen, half frozen. The cosmos wears the scars of angelic rebellion at multiple levels. And Enoch is not just a tourist here. In some versions of the text, he's asked to speak to them, to call them back to praise. He becomes briefly a kind of heavenly preacher, urging the Gregorii to resume glorifying God. Whether they fully respond isn't entirely clear. The manuscripts diverge, but the scene suggests that even in their mournful state, their story isn't completely finished. This layering of watcher traditions is part of what makes 2 Enochs so hard to pin down historically and so fascinating theologically. On one side, you have a careful, almost priestly concern with calendars and the proper ordering of time in the fourth heaven. On the other, you have a myth of cosmic disorder in the fifth. Angels who were meant to guard the world and lead worship instead, introducing chaos on earth and paralysis in heaven. The message woven through the tour is subtle but sharp. Even the movements of the sun and moon are part of a moral drama. Time itself is structured around obedience and disobedience, appointed courses and catastrophic detours. The Gregorii are a warning. Beings stationed high with noble tasks can fall, and when they do, their fall reverberates through the whole system. By the time Enoch leaves the fifth heaven, he's seen storms stored, rebels chained, paradise planted, punishments mapped, time regulated, and watches broken. The higher levels that await him will push the pattern even further, from compromised angels to the unshaken archangels, and finally to the throne, where all these stories of order and rebellion are being held in a single inscrutable plan. In the sixth heaven, the mood flips again. If the fifth heaven is paralysis and regret, the sixth is motion, structure, and unbroken loyalty. It's like stepping out of a room full of wounded veterans into a war room that's still fully operational. Here, Enoch sees the big organizers. 2. Enoch describes hosts of archangels stationed in the sixth heaven, and their job isn't vague or decorative. They are administrators of reality. They're assigned to oversee cosmic order and human affairs in shockingly concrete ways. Some command the courses of the stars and the paths of the planets, making sure the machinery Enoch just saw in the fourth heaven runs according to plan. Others are charged with supervising nations, cities, and individual human lives. Still others handle prayers and repentance, fing words upward and divine decrees downward. The text starts listing roles in a way that sounds almost bureaucratic. Angels over the seasons, over the fruits of the earth, over human souls, over the recording of deeds, over the distribution of blessings. It's as if every process you could think of, whether birth, death, judgment, is being tracked and managed by some order of beings in the sixth heaven. And they are not all the same rank. 2. Enoch leans into hierarchy. It describes different choirs and classes of angels arranged in strict tiers. There are archangels who stand closer to the divine commands, then angels of lordships, powers, principalities, angelic scribes, angelic warriors, angelic intercessors. The vocabulary overlaps with what later Christian texts will call the angelic hierarchies. But to Enoch is already imagining a layered system where authority flows downward and praise flows upward in a carefully ordered cascade. Each choir has its own liturgy. Some continuously bless the name of God. Others shout the responses. Some are responsible for composing new hymns. Others carry out judgments that those hymns describe. The impression is of a living, breathing bureaucracy of holiness, a universe where nothing just happens. Everything is assigned, everything is watched, everything is written down. From a Second Temple Jewish perspective that fits, texts like Daniel already hint that empires have princes in the heavenly realm, that nations and individuals are attached to angelic patrons. To Enoch takes that idea and builds a whole level of heaven out of it. The sixth heaven is where the moral infrastructure is kept running. If the fourth heaven is the cosmic clock, the sixth is the moral administration office staffed by beings who never sleep and never break rank, and Enoch, a human, is suddenly standing in their midst. The text hints that he's being introduced to them almost as a colleague in training. He's shown the angelic scribes who write down all human deeds. He meets the angels who bear the prayers of men before God. He's told about those who record the store of merit and sin, who keep track of almsgiving, injustice, repentance, and stubbornness. You can feel the narrative edging toward its big reveal. The reason Enoch is being shown all this is because he's about to be drawn into that system himself. But not yet, because above the sixth heaven lies the place that dwarfs everything he's seen so far, the seventh. When Enoch is taken up again, the text shifts gears. The language strains. Suddenly, you get phrases like indescribable light, ineffable glory, unbearable majesty. The seventh heaven is not just another floor with more angels. It is in Enoch's imagination the dwelling place of the divine throne. He sees ranks of fiery beings, many-eyed creatures, seraphim with tongues of flame. He hears outbursts of praise so intense that according to some manuscripts, the heavens themselves tremble. These are the innermost choirs, the ones who stand right before the throne, covering their faces, calling back and forth with words Enoch isn't even allowed to repeat. And then there's the throne itself. Enoch describes it as a vast, radiant seat of light surrounded by fire and voices with a form like a man seated upon it. The figure is wrapped in light greater than the sun, cloaked in glory that burns like molten metal. Enoch doesn't just see brightness, he feels terror. The text makes a point of saying he is overwhelmed, crushed by the intensity of what he's witnessing. His bones, he says, seemed to melt, his knees buckled. He thought he would die. This is not a cozy vision of God. It's much closer to the kind of throne vision you get in Ezekiel 1, where the prophet sees a storm cloud, living creatures with 4 faces, wheels within wheels full of eyes, and above them, a likeness of a throne. And above the throne the likeness as the appearance of a man. The language in 2 Enoch echoes that ancient Merkabah or chariot throne imagery, fiery beings, multiple wings, layered platforms, indescribable brightness, a human-like figure enthroned. Later, Jewish mysticism would take these throne visions and turn them into elaborate ascent traditions where visionaries travel through palaces of fire, confronted at each gate by terrifying guardians. 2 Enoch sits at an interesting intersection in that development. It preserves an early raw version of the experience, the crushing weight of divine glory, the layered angelic security system, the sense that to get too close without permission is lethal. And that's the key detail. Enoch doesn't fully enter. He approaches, he sees, he falls on his face, but he is not yet welcomed into the innermost space. He's protected by his angelic escorts. They shield him, strengthen him, help him survive the vision. In some recent, they even plead on his behalf, asking God to let this human stand a little closer, hear a little more. The narrative is careful to keep a gap between creature and creator, even as it teases the possibility that the gap might be partly bridged. That in-between status is theologically loaded. On one level, it underscores divine transcendence. Even the 6th heaven archangels who manage the universe are still servants who stand at a distance from the throne. Enoch as a mortal is doubly distant. He can witness but not yet belong. On another level, it sets up what 2 Enoch is about to do with him. The fact that Enoch can even get this close signals that something unprecedented is happening. This isn't just a guided tour, it's an initiation. By stopping him just short of full entry, the text creates tension. Will he remain a visitor, or will he somehow be drawn into the inner circle? For now, the answer is a deliberate not yet. Enoch has seen the moral bureaucracy of the 6th heaven and the shattering glory of the 7th. He's glimpsed the throne that anchors all the stories of obedience and rebellion he's been shown so far. But his own story, how a human could move from earth to the edge of that throne room, and what that means for creation itself, still has another turn to take in the realms beyond. You'd think that would be the end of the tour. 7 heavens, throne of God, fiery beings, bones melting, roll credits. But in one strand of the 2 Enoch tradition, the story doesn't stop there. Just when you think Enoch has hit the ceiling of the universe, the text quietly opens a trap door. There are more levels. In the longer ascension, the expanded version preserved in some Slavonic manuscripts, Enoch is taken beyond the 7th heaven into realms that most readers of the Bible have never even heard of. An 8th, a 9th, and finally a 10th heaven. And this is where 2 Enoch's cosmology really starts to feel alien, experimental, almost like a theological laboratory, where ancient writers are trying out new ideas about space, time, and the mechanics of the cosmos. The shift is subtle at first. After the blinding glory of the throne room, the 8th and 9th heavens are described less as separate habitats full of new types of beings, and more as higher bands of the cosmic machine. If the lower heavens are like floors in a building, these upper ones are more like the roof space and the control room above it. The 8th heaven, sometimes called Museloth in the text, is where Enoch encounters the structure that governs the fixed stars and the zodiac. Here, 2 Enoch starts sounding less like a pure vision and more like a piece of ancient astronomy wrapped in apocalyptic language. The author describes the circles of the firmament and the signs that mark out the path of the year. The stars are not just pretty points of light. They are organized into constellations divided into 12 houses that the sun passes through in order structuring time and seasons. The 8th heaven is portrayed as the zone where the great celestial calendar is inscribed, the place that locks in the rhythms of months, years, and agricultural cycles. This is where you can feel the influence of broader ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean thought. By the late Second Temple period, Jews living under Greek and later Roman rule were not isolated from Hellenistic astronomy and astrology. The idea of a zodiacal band circling the sky, divided into 12 signs, through which the sun and planets travel, was standard scientific knowledge of the day. 2. Enoch takes that conceptual framework and puts it in a biblical register, not as impersonal fate, but as a divinely supervised lattice of time. The ninth heaven goes a step further. In some versions of the text, it's called Kuchavim, the heaven of the stars, and it's treated as the highest visible layer of the cosmos, the outer shell that turns above everything else. If the eighth is about the structure of time, the zodiac, the year, the regular dance of constellations, the ninth is like the giant gear that moves the whole arrangement. The language here is dense and a bit technical. Enoch is shown the upper firmaments, where the celestial bodies are fastened and their courses are regulated, so that they neither speed up nor slow down without command. It's as if he's being shown the governor on the engine of the universe. This is still religious literature, but under the imagery you can see a real attempt to describe celestial mechanics. Nested spheres, fixed stars, moving lights, carefully measured rotations. Scholars who work on 2 Enoch have noticed that these upper heavens resemble in rough outline late antique models of the cosmos, where different layers of heavens correspond to different types of motion. And then there's the 10th, snorts. In the longer ascension, all of this astronomical scaffolding is not the top. The text pushes Enoch one level higher into what it simply calls the 10th heaven and gives it a new name, Aravoth. Here too Enoch stops talking about stars and starts talking about God again. Aravoth is not a machinery level. It is not the zodiac band or the sphere of fixed stars. It is the highest heaven, the place, the text says, where the Lord is. This is where Enoch finally meets God, not as a distant crushing light on a throne glimpsed from below, but in direct address. In this 10th heaven scene, God speaks to Enoch face to face, or as close to that idea as an ancient Jewish author is willing to risk. The divine voice calls him, "My child," reveals secrets of creation and judgment, and commissions him for his role as heavenly scribe and intermediary. The emphasis is less on what Enoch sees and more on what he hears. Mysteries of time, cosmology, and human destiny that are not recorded anywhere else. It's a striking move. The 7th heaven had already been framed as the throne level. In many Jewish and Christian texts, that's the top. Here, though, 2 Enochs splits the difference. The 7th is the throne, as seen from below, surrounded by fiery choirs and saturated with terror. The 10th is the hidden inner chamber, above and beyond the whole visible cosmos, where the Creator who designed all those heavens actually speaks. Not everyone is convinced this was part of the original story. A lot of scholars suspect that the 8th, 9th, and 10th heavens belong to a later expansion. The fact that they only appear in the longer ascension, and that their language sometimes sounds more technical and cosmological than the earlier chapters, has led many to think that an editor or community of scribes added them after the core of 2 Enoch was composed. On this reading, the earliest layer of the text may have ended with the 7th heaven throne vision, in line with other apocalyptic works of the period. The extra heavens with their zodiac bands and nested spheres could reflect a later stage where Jewish writers had absorbed more detailed Greek astronomical ideas and wanted their sacred cosmology to keep pace. But that's not a settled question. Some argue that the multi-layer structure might go back to an original now lost Hebrew or Greek verge, and that the shorter ascension is the one that trimmed things down. And even if the upper heavens were later additions, they still tell us something important about how the communities that preserve 2 Enoch were thinking. They show a universe that's getting more complicated. Genesis gives you a relatively simple 3-tier model: heavens above, earth in the middle, waters, and underworld below. Even when other biblical texts start hinting at multiple heavens, they don't map them in detail. 2. Enoch's expanded cosmology, especially with its 8th and 9th heavens, looks like an attempt to reconcile that older vertical picture with a more mathematical spherical cosmos. 7 heavens are no longer enough. You need a place for the zodiac, for the fixed stars, for the mechanics that make days, seasons, and years tick like clockwork. And then you need a realm above all that, untouched by the movements of time and matter, where God and His words simply are. In that sense, the extra heavens function like a bridge. They connect biblical throne imagery with late antique science. They turn the sky from a flat dome into a layered rotating system. And they suggest that for the scribes copying to Enoch, revelation and cosmology were not separate projects. If God had revealed the structure of judgment and morality in the lower heavens, why wouldn't He also reveal the hidden architecture of the stars, whether original or added Judean or later Christian, the 8th, 9th, and 10th heavens in 2 Enoch, pull the text into a bigger, stranger universe than Genesis ever sketches. A universe where the path from earth to God runs not just through clouds and angel armies, but through bands of stars, circles of time, and finally beyond the outermost sphere, into a place with no orbit at all. And it's from that highest motionless place that Enoch will be told how the moving world began. From that motionless place beyond the stars, God does something unexpected. He doesn't just show Enoch the finished universe as if they were looking at a cosmic map together. He rewinds the whole thing. He walks Enoch back step by step into the time before there were heavens at all. And in 2 Enoch, that rewind looks very different from the calm, measured let there be of Genesis. In Genesis 1, the opening is almost minimalist. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth is formless and void. Darkness is over the deep. The Spirit of God moves on the waters. Then come the day's light and darkness, sky and sea, land and plants, sun and moon, animals, humans. It's structured liturgical, almost like a temple service in narrative form. In 2 Enoch, when God starts dictating creation to Enoch, the mood is more explosive. First, there is God alone, with no one beside Him, no angels, no world, nothing. Then God speaks a command, and instead of immediately getting sky and land, the text introduces a new figure, a doy. God calls a doyle out of the very lowest foundation, and a doyle appears before Him as a kind of primordial mass. The description is strange and dense. Adidil is full of great light and very great fire, a compressed universe in potential. When God commands, id oil bursts, expands, and from this bursting come the upper heavens, the light world, the invisible realm, the ranks of higher angels, the luminous structure of the cosmos. This is not language you find anywhere in Genesis. Then God does something parallel. He calls forth a second primordial being, Arcus. Arcus is the dark counterpart to Adidil, where Adidil contains the seeds of light and the upper heavens. Arcus is heavy, thick, cloudy, a kind of proto. When God commands Arcus to open, it doesn't burst upward into light. It condenses downward. From Arcus come the lower visible heavens, the firmament we'd recognize from Genesis, the atmospheric sky, the waters, the earth, and everything that grows and lives on it. In other words, 2 Enoch takes the biblical idea of God creating heaven and earth and filters it through 2 personified principles. A luminous Adoili generating the higher spiritual realms, and a shadowy Arcus generating the lower material realms. Scholars have argued for decades about what to do with these names. To some, Adoil and Arcus look like echoes of older Near Eastern or even Iranian cosmologies, where the world emerges from primordial beings or cosmic eggs, or from the separation of a higher light realm and a lower dark one. Others see in Adid's bursting something that feels almost eerily modern, a mythic precursor to the idea of an initial expansion. Not because the writer had any scientific model in mind, but because any attempt to imagine everything from nothing tends to reach for the image of a compressed source exploding outward. Whatever their background, Doyle and Arcus are doing something the author of Genesis never tries to do. They insert an extra stage between God alone and the world as we know it. Creation comes not simply by divine fiat, but through these 2 primordial agents, summoned, filled with potential, then cracked open on command. Once the heavens and earth have been laid out in this 2-stage way, 2 Enoch circles back to more familiar territory, God orders the divisions of water and dry land. He fixes the courses of the sun, moon, and stars, much like Genesis 1 does on the fourth day. He populates the earth with plants, animals, and finally humans. But even here, the details shift. Genesis tells you humanity is made from dust of the ground animated by God's breath. It's a powerful image, but general. In 2 Enoch, when God explains Adam's creation to Enoch, the process is almost anatomical, like a recipe recited in heaven. Adam, God says, was formed from 7 substances, each linked to a part of his body and to a cosmic element. His flesh comes from the earth, his blood from the dew and the sea, his eyes from the sun, his bones from stone, his thoughts from the speed of angels and clouds, his veins from the depths of the abyss, his spirit from God's own breath, the wind or spirit that moves through the world. The idea here is clear. Adam is not just dust plus breath, he is a microcosm. His body is a stitched-together summary of the entire universe. Every layer of creation, from the underworld waters to the highest lights, is present in him in miniature. This sevenfold composition has no direct parallel in Genesis. It sounds more like later Jewish and Christian mystical speculation, where Adam Kadmon or the primordial man embodies the cosmos, or like Hellenistic philosophical traditions that describe the human being as a little world mirroring the Great One to Enoch, if early could be one of the roots feeding into that later symbolism. Put all this together, asThe and archas as primordial beings, the bursting of light and condensation of matter, Adam as a 7-part microcosm, and the creation account in 2 Enoch starts to look like a hybrid. On one side, it's firmly in conversation with Genesis. God is still utterly transcendent. Creation is still by command, not by combat with rival gods. There's no divine consort, no pantheon. The sequence of ordering, heavens, firmament, luminaries, earth, living creatures, humans clearly echoes the biblical pattern. On the other side, it feels like someone has opened up Genesis 1 and written a commentary in mythic form between the lines. What exactly happened before in the beginning to Enoch says, asThe and archas summoned from the deep foundations. What exactly does it mean to say Adam was made from dust? 2 Enoch answers from 7 distinct cosmic ingredients, making him the living intersection of all realms. What is the relation between invisible and visible creation? 2 Enoch splits them into upper and lower worlds, born from different primordial sources. Does that mean 2 Enoch is preserving some pre-Genesis cosmological layer, an older set of ideas that the concise prose of Genesis later simplified? Some researchers have pushed in that direction. They point to the way asThe and archas sound like they belong to a mythic, perhaps even semi-personified cosmology that might predate the more stripped-down monotheism of the priestly writer in Genesis 1. They note convergences with other ancient creation stories, where cosmic orders emerge from primordial beings rather than appearing directly on command. Others are more cautious. They argue that 2 Enoch is more likely building on Genesis than the other way around, expanding a familiar narrative with speculative details drawn from Hellenistic philosophy, apocalyptic imagination, and maybe scraps of older myth. But in a late Second Temple or even early Christian context on this reading, asThe and archas are not fossils from a forgotten pre-Genesis world. They are creative theological devices invented to explain how a transcendent God could produce both spiritual and material realms without compromising his uniqueness. The text itself doesn't settle the debate. It never says this is older than Moses, or these are secrets that the Torah left out. It simply has God tell Enoch in the 10th heaven, "I will explain to you how all things were made," and then unfolds a creation story that feels at once familiar and alien, biblical and experimental. What we can say is that 2 Enoch's creation account pushes the imagination of Genesis in directions the canonical text never explores. It fills the silent gap before the beginning with bursting primordial beings. It turns Adam from a figure of dust into a walking cosmos. It splits heaven and earth into twin emanations, light and dark, upper and lower, without ever giving up the idea that one God stands behind it all. Whether that represents a memory of older cosmologies or a bold reworking of a known scripture, it shows us just how fluid ancient Jewish thought about creation could be. Genesis for the communities behind 2 Enoch wasn't the end of the story. It was the starting point for a whole universe of questions, and some of the most troubling of those questions had to do with what went wrong in that universe almost immediately, how a perfect creation ended up with rebellion, corruption, and death. In 2 Enoch, the answer begins not in Eden, but in heaven itself, with a figure named Satan, and a fool that reshapes the moral architecture of the cosmos. In Genesis, the first hint of evil inside the story appears as a serpent in a garden. The serpent is crafty, dangerous, somehow opposed to God's command. But the text never tells you where it came from, why it's there, or how it got that way. It just appears fully formed as a tempter. 2. Enoch doesn't leave things that open-ended. Long before Adam is molded from his 7 substances, long before Eve, long before a garden is planted, something has already gone wrong in heaven. And the text gives that something a name, Satan. Not Satan yet. Satanale. That little L at the end matters. In biblical and Jewish tradition, it marks a being as belonging to God's entourage. Male, Gabriel, Raphael, who is like God. God is my strength. God has healed. Satan in 2 Enoch is not an independent dark power. He begins as one of the holy ones bearing the same divine syllable in his name as the loyal archangels. When God is showing Enoch the layered heavens, he pauses in the 5th. The 5th heaven in 2 Enoch is the realm of the Gregori, the wakeful ones, a class of angels who sound a lot like the Watchers we met earlier, the ones connected to the stories of heavenly beings descending and corrupting the earth. But in this version the crisis happens even earlier, before there is any human world to corrupt. God tells Enoch that once all these angels stood in proper order, they were created good. They had their appointed ranks and tasks. Then Satan, who is portrayed as a great prince among them, refuses to bow before God's newly established order. In some versions of the tradition, the trigger is the creation of the visible cosmos, or the announcement of humanity's future dignity. In 2 Enoch, the details are more compressed, but the logic is similar. Satan exalts himself. He decides that the heavenly hierarchy isn't enough for him. He will place his throne above the stars. He will become equal to God. It's the classic sin of pride. But unlike Genesis, where pride is coded in a human grasping for forbidden knowledge, here pride erupts among the angels before any human has taken a breath. The result is immediate and catastrophic. Satan and the angels who join him are cast down from their station. Their faces were darkened. Their glory is stripped away. The text hints that some of them end up imprisoned in lower regions, others wandering in a kind of cosmic exile. Crucially, this all happens before Adam. By the time the first human is formed, the moral landscape of the universe is already fractured. There is already a history of rebellion in the heavens. That timing is one of 2 Enoch's most striking departures from the Bible. You might know in Genesis, if you only read that book, evil looks like it starts with human disobedience. There is no explicit backstory for a devil, no cosmic civil war. Even in Job, where the Satan appears, he's not yet a full-blown fallen archangel. He's a kind of prosecuting attorney in God's court, testing Job with God's permission, not opposing God's will from outside. 2. Enoch, by contrast, pushes toward the later Christian picture. A high angelic figure falls through pride before human history begins, and that fall becomes the seedbed of subsequent evil. You can almost watch a theology of Satan crystallizing. Satan loses the L, loses his place, and becomes the adversary. Later, Christian writers will make this explicit. Satan as a ruined angel, the devil as once bright Lucifer. 2. Enoch doesn't yet have all the developed demonological furniture you find in medieval theology. No elaborate infernal hierarchies, no named princes of specific sins. But the basic template is here. A primordial rebellion, a leader, a punishment that relocates him from the fifth heaven to the lower regions, a world that will from now on be contested territory. This puts 2 Enoch in conversation with a whole family of apocryphal false stories. In the Greek life of Adam and Eve, for instance, a figure sometimes identified with Satan refuses to bow to the newly created Adam and is cast out. In the Book of the Watchers, the opening part of 1 Enoch, heavenly beings descend, take human wives, teach forbidden arts, and are bound in the depths until the final judgment. In some strands of early Christian literature, Satan's fall is explicitly linked to envy of humanity or refusal to serve a creature of clay. 2. Enoch seems to stand somewhere in the middle of all this. Its Satanael is not just a lustful watcher corrupted by earthly desire, but a cosmic rebel, an angelic prince who revolts against God's supremacy itself. Yet his story is told inside a larger architecture of multiple heavens, watchful angels, books of destiny, and a meticulously ordered cosmos. Evil is a disruption of that order, not a rival to it, and that may be the key difference from Genesis. Genesis gives you a world that is very good, a human couple who break a command and a serpent whose deeper identity is left unsaid. If you want to know why there is a tempter at all, you have to look outside the text into later interpretation to Enoch builds the explanation into its very blueprint of the cosmos. By the time Adam is walking as a microcosm of heaven and earth, there is already a rift in the heaven part of that equation. Satanael's fall makes evil something that originates in misused freedom among God's own servants, not an equal power or an accident baked into matter itself. It offers, in other words, a more fully articulated theology of where moral darkness comes from, one that will echo in different forms all the way through later Jewish mysticism and Christian demonology. But to Enoch doesn't stop with the story of rebellion. It also rethinks how that story fits into the structure of time itself, adding an extra day beyond Genesis 7 and hinting that even evil has a place within a much larger cosmic cycle. In Genesis, the structure is clean. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest, and then the story flows straight into human history. Time feels like a line. Beginning, middle, eventual, end. The week is a rhythm inside that line, but it's not the skeleton of the entire cosmos. 2. Enoch quietly rewires that when Enoch is shown the creation in God's own voice. The days are still there. Light, firmament, luminaries, living creatures. It sounds familiar. But then the text adds something that Genesis never does. After the 7th day, the day of God's rest, there is talk of an 8th day. And that extra day isn't just a calendar quirk, it's a symbol in 2 Enoch. The 7th day belongs to this present world, the cycle of work and rest that structures mortal life. The 8th day points beyond it. It's linked to the age to come, an eternal day when ordinary time stops counting. Some manuscripts even gloss it explicitly as the beginning of another world. It's as if the author takes the Genesis week and stretches it into a hinge, 7 for now, 8 for forever. That same logic gets scaled up into a massive cosmic timetable. Scattered through the text is a theology of a 7,000-year cosmic week. Just as God created in 6 days and rested on the 7th, so human history itself unfolds as 6 great days of toil, understood as 6,000 years, followed by a 7th, 0,000-year period of rest and judgment. Each millennium becomes a day in God's calendar. This isn't spelled out in a neat chart the way later theologians will do it, but you can see the pattern. Enoch is told about appointed times, about fixed periods and circles in which God has arranged everything, the stars, the fates of nations, the lifespan of the world. The idea is that the cosmos doesn't just have a beginning and an end. It has a built-in weekly rhythm on a grand scale. And then, hovering beyond that 7th 0,000-year Sabbath, lurks the same idea as the 8th day. Once the cosmic week is finished, there is a transition into something qualitatively different. The world that never returns to Monday morning. No more counted days, no more turning of the ages, just what 2 Enoch calls the Great Age, or endless light. If you know Jewish Sabbath theology, All of this sounds familiar and strange at the same time. In the Hebrew Bible and later rabbinic thought, the Sabbath is a sign between God and Israel, a memorial of creation and the Exodus, a taste of future rest. There are already hints in some Second Temple texts that the Messianic age will be like a Sabbath for the world. But 2. Enoch pushes that intuition right into the architecture of time. It doesn't just say the future is like a Sabbath. It implies that history literally culminates in a Sabbath millennium and then passes into an eighth eternal day. Later, Christian millenarianism will seize that structure. Church writers like Irenaeus and Lactantius will talk about 6,000 years of history followed by a 1,000-year reign of Christ, a Sabbath rest for creation before the final eternal state. Early Christians will also develop their own theology of the eighth day, Sunday as the day of resurrection, the day beyond the Jewish Sabbath, a symbol of the new creation. Baptismal fonts in octagonal shapes, church fathers calling Easter the eighth day. The imagery keeps echoing. 2 Enoch stands right on the threshold of those developments. The text probably isn't Christian in origin, but later Christian scribes certainly copied and preserved it, and some parts may show Christian reworking. The result is a document where a distinctly Jewish Sabbath-shaped sense of time overlaps with patterns that will become classically Christian, a 7,000-year world week crowned by an eighth eternal day. Underneath it all is a different intuition about time than the one you get if you only read Genesis straight. Genesis gives you a linear week that inaugurates a linear history. God creates, rests, and then the timeline unfurls. Patriarchs, Exodus, kings, exile. There are cycles of sin and redemption, but the week itself isn't directly mapped onto the lifespan of the cosmos. In 2 Enoch, time is still moving toward a goal, but it moves in circles within circles. There's the ordinary 7-day week, mirroring the 7 days of creation. There's the 7,000-year week of world history, mirroring the same pattern on a higher scale. And then above that, in a sense outside the clock entirely, is the eighth day, eternity as the day after the last day. The moment when the circle breaks into a line that never ends. The text reinforces this with numerology. 7 is everywhere. 7 heavens, 7-fold substances of Adam, 7 chief archangels, 7 days. It's the number of fullness of a system complete and balanced. When something is described in sevens in 2 Enoch, it's a signal that you're looking at a finished structure, the whole set. 8, by contrast, is the number of overflow. It's what happens when a complete system is surpassed. An eighth day after 7, an eighth sphere outside the 7 heavens, an eighth age beyond the cosmic week. Whenever 8 shows up, it's pointing to what cannot be contained inside the ordinary cycles: resurrection, judgment, the unending kingdom. That numerological language isn't just decoration, it's how the book thinks. The rise and fall of generations, the rebellion of Satan, the coming judgment, all of it is slotted into this pattern time. Angelic books contain not just names and deeds, but portions of years. The heavenly scribes record the rotations of the luminaries alongside the destinies of people and nations. To exist in 2 Enoch is to occupy a specific place in a layered, measured, almost musical arrangement of time. And that's where the apocalyptic edge of the text really sharpens. If the world is a cosmic week already racing toward its Sabbath, then history is not open-ended. There is a schedule. The present age is late Friday or early Saturday, depending on how you count. Saturnal's fall, the corruption of the earth, even the visions granted to Enoch. They're all signs that the week is nearing its close, that the final day of rest and reckoning is approaching. Genesis invites you to marvel that the world exists at all. 2. Enoch invites you to ask how long this arrangement will be allowed to continue, and then whispers that the answer has already been written into the calendar of the cosmos, circling closer, day by numbered day, toward the moment when the eighth day dawns and time as we know it simply runs out. In Genesis, Enoch's whole story fits into a single sentence. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more because God took him. No details, no explanation, just a disappearance. To Enoch takes that missing moment and stretches it into one of the most dramatic transformations in ancient religious literature. It doesn't just tell you that God took Enoch, it shows you what it means to be taken out of human life and rebuilt for heaven. By the time Enoch reaches the highest heaven in the Slavonic text, he's not just a tourist anymore. The heavenly tour stops. The lectures about the cosmos pause. The focus shifts from the architecture of the universe to the architecture of a single human being. And then the makeover begins. In several manuscripts, God gives a direct order to Michael. Strip Enoch of his earthly clothing and anoint him. That sounds like a wardrobe change, but in the logic of the book, clothing is identity. Flesh itself is a kind of outfit suited to one realm and useless in another. So the angels remove his garments and wash him. He is anointed with fragrant oil that shines more brightly than the great light, and his face begins to burn like the sun. His bones are strengthened. His body is made like one of the glorious ones. In some recensions, God explicitly says, "From today you will be called my son or my child," and Enoch is seated close to the divine throne. This isn't metaphorical piety, it's described as a literal sensory process. He feels the oil, he feels the change. He's almost blinded by his own radiance. Enoch goes up as a mortal and step by step is refashioned into something angelic. The key symbol for that change is clothing. Once his human garments are gone, he's wrapped in garments of glory, the same kind of shining robes other angels wear around the throne. In Second Temple texts, what you wear often reveals what you are. Priestly vestments on earth imitate heavenly patterns. White robes in apocalyptic visions signal purity and reward. In 2 Enoch, the logic goes one level deeper. Celestial garments don't just symbolize a new status, they confer it. Put differently, the ritual doesn't just tell the reader, Enoch is special. Now, it makes Enoch capable of existing in a realm where untransformed flesh would simply disintegrate. That has huge theological implications. In most of the Hebrew Bible, angels and humans are different orders of being. Angels are messengers burning with something of God's own fire. Humans are dust animated by breath, fragile and limited. 2 Enoch quietly challenges the rigidity of that line. If a human can be stripped of mortal form, anointed, reclothed, and set among the angels, then humanity is not just a lower species looking up, it's a potential angel in Laval form. The distance between earth and heaven is still enormous, but it's traversable. Under the right conditions, with God's initiative, a human being can be upgraded. Later, Jewish mysticism will run with that idea. Centuries after 2 Enoch in the Hesselot and Merkava literature, you find stories of rabbis ascending through the heavenly palaces. They too are clothed in glory, given angelic names, sometimes identified with specific high-ranking angels. One famous text describes Enoch himself transformed into Metatron, the lesser YHW, seated on a throne, wearing robes of light crowned with crowns. The pattern is the same. Ascent, stripping, clothing, a new identity, a status perilously close to the divine. 2 Enoch looks like an earlier, less systematized version of that same ascent logic. Here, the transformation is unique, a one-off gift to the patriarch who pleased God. But the mechanics are already in place. Ritual anointing, oiled flesh that shines like lightning, garments of glory, a seat near the throne. Later mystics will take that once-in-history transformation and ask, what if others could taste some version of this through prayer, asceticism, and visionary ascent? Set that beside Genesis, and the contrast is stark. Genesis reports the outcome. God took him, but hides the process. It leaves Enoch's fate as a bare mystery, a kind of narrative question mark hanging in the middle of the genealogy. 2 Enoch answers that question with maximal detail, where Genesis gives you a vanish to Enoch, gives you a rite of passage, described almost like an ordination into the heavenly priesthood. And then there's the twist. Enoch doesn't just stay up there. After his transformation, God sends him back down temporarily, not as the same man who went up, but as someone who has seen the end of the cosmic calendar, heard the secrets of creation, and worn the garments of another world. His own family can barely handle his presence. In some versions, his face is so bright they have to fall at his feet. He eats and speaks with them. But he's no longer quite one of them. His changed status is marked in multiple ways. He becomes a teacher, pouring out the revelations he's received. He blesses his children, warns the generations to come, sets ethical and liturgical patterns for his descendants. He is now the hinge between worlds, a human who has crossed the border and returned as a messenger of that other side. In the logic of 2 Enoch, this is what it looks like for time itself to crack open. The same text that plays with an 8th day beyond history also gives you a human being who has already stepped into that beyond and come back bearing its light. His transformation is both a singular miracle and a preview. It hints that the destiny of humanity in the age to come is not just to be forgiven or preserved, but to be transfigured, to exchange the old garments for something that can stand in the presence of endless light. When Enoch comes back down, he doesn't just glow at his family and bless a few grandchildren. He starts writing to Enoch, makes a startling claim. This transformed, almost angelic figure is commanded to become the first great scribe of heaven. Not a casual note-taker, not a village wise man, a human being ordered by God to download the architecture of reality into books. In the Slavonic versions, the number is precise and almost absurd. 366. God doesn't say write some things. He says in effect, write everything I have shown you. And the narrative doubles down on the scale. Enoch is given a pen, ink, and parchment by angels for 30 days and 30 nights. He sits surrounded by his sons and the elders of the people, and he writes without stopping, while heavenly scribes dictate. By the end of the scene, the stack is unthinkably large. Hundreds of books covering the mysteries of creation, the structure of the heavens, the courses of the stars, the calendar of years, the moral law, the future judgment. Then, almost casually, the text gives the number 366 books. To a modern reader, that looks like mystical overkill. But in the mental world of late Second Temple Judaism and the cultures around it, that number is doing quiet, symbolic work. Most ancient calendars weren't built on a neat 365 days system. They were messy like the sky itself. Egypt had 365 days. The Jewish calendar was lunar solar, needing adjustments. The Roman world would eventually settle on 365 with a leap day. And in several systems, there's this sense that the perfect year is just a little more than 365. That the heavens run on cycles slightly larger than the basic count. 366 is 365 plus 1. 1 day beyond the ordinary year, 1 unit beyond the complete circle. It matches the way 2 Enoch already plays with the idea of an 8th day beyond the 7-day creation week. If 7 is completion, 8 is what comes after completion. If 365 marks a full year, 366 hints at surplus, fullness, plus overflow. So, when the text says Enoch writes 366 books, it isn't just telling you he wrote a lot. It's telling you he contains the full cycle of divine knowledge plus something extra that breaks the frame. He doesn't just cover every day of the year. He reaches into the leap day, the marginal hidden piece that isn't always counted. This is where Enoch's role shifts from visionary to conduit. In 2 Enoch, he is explicitly set up as an intermediary between a secret heavenly archive and the fragile world of human generations. He's seen the 7 heavens. He stood before the throne. He's been reclothed in glory. Now that altered status is translated into text. The knowledge that normally stays sealed up with angels and fiery wheels is poured into human language line after line, page after page. The book itself emphasizes that this isn't optional. Enoch is commanded to pass the wisdom on, especially to his sons and to chosen wise men who will preserve it. They gather around him as he writes, and when the 30 days are up, Enoch doesn't just hand over a library and disappear. He gives instructions. He tells his sons to read these books constantly, to copy them, to guard them. He warns them against idolatry and injustice. He lays out ethical codes, liturgical practices, and calendar rules. The same voice that has just described cosmic chambers of snow and fire now tells his children how to treat the poor, how to judge fairly, how to marry, how to keep festivals. The highest mysteries and the most practical morality arrive in the same package, and then he says something even more unsettling. Parts of this knowledge are not for everyone. 2. Enoch draws lines around its own revelations. Some books are for all the people, for teaching and guidance. Others are for the wise among your children, those capable of holding secrets without abusing them. The text plays with a graded access model, public instruction, inner circle wisdom, and a still deeper layer that seems to remain tied to Enoch's own transformed status. That graded axis links to Enoch to a much older Near Eastern pattern. In ancient Mesopotamian tradition, there's a figure named Enma-Durrani, king of Sippar, taken up by the gods, shown the secrets of heaven and earth, and then sent back with divine tablets and techniques. He learns divination, mathematical astronomy, ritual procedures. He becomes the prototype of the learned priest, the one from whom lines of scribes and temple experts claim descent. The parallels are hard to ignore, and Medaranki is given the tablet of the gods and the bag of the gods, symbols of constrained priestly knowledge. He passes that on to a guild. Enoch is given heavenly books and the authority to write more. He passes them on to his sons and to selected great men of the earth. Both are lineal figures who stand between cosmic order and ordinary society, between inscrutable gods and people who just want a decent harvest and safe children. Scholars have noticed this. Some see 2 Enoch as a Jewish reworking of the Mesopotamian sage pattern. Instead of a Babylonian king initiated into astral law, you get the 7th antediluvian patriarch initiated into the structure of the cosmos and the moral law. Instead of the gods of heaven conferring tablet teaching on a royal priesthood, the God of Israel and his angels confer a 366-volume revelation on a righteous ancestor who then becomes the fountainhead of later wisdom. That's where the esoteric flavor of Enoch really starts to crystallize. Because if Enoch wrote 366 books and only a few cryptic Enochic texts survive in our hands, most of that revelation is by definition lost. The text invites you to imagine a gigantic hidden library behind the fragments we have. It positions Enoch as the origin of sciences, calendars, ethical codes, temple knowledge, an entire world of instruction that later ages only glimpse in scattered pages. For later mystics and apocalyptic writers, this was irresistible. Enoch becomes the patron saint of secret knowledge, the one who knows the lengths of the heavens, the names of angels, the weight of the earth, the future of souls after death. In some later literature, people claim their own writings come from hidden Enoch books or from revelations that Enoch left for the last days. The figure of the patriarch turns into a kind of cosmic librarian whose catalogue we no longer possess. But into Enoch itself, the emphasis stays surprisingly homely. He leaves for good. Enoch gathers his sons and gives them a final set of instructions. He tells them to choose righteousness over violence, to avoid mixing with the lawless, to honor God with sacrifices from clean hearts rather than empty ritual. He warns them of coming judgment, the flood that will wipe away the wicked. He urges them to cling to the books he's written as their anchor when he is gone. Then he divides up his instructions to Methuselah in particular. He entrusts a special share, leadership of the family, guardianship of the writings. It's a passing of the torch from the man who has walked in both worlds to the descendants who will have to live in one, guided only by memory and text. In that moment, the 366 books are more than a mystical statistic. They're the physical trace of a vanished presence, the way a being who has outgrown the earth still touches it. The transformed Enoch cannot stay permanently among humans, but his words can. His sons can't follow him into the 7th heaven, but they can open a scroll and hear echoes of what it sounded like when a human being stood there. From the perspective of the narrative, that's the offer to Enoch is really making. You, the reader, do not get to ascend with Enoch or wear garments of glory. but you can listen in as he dictates. You can be, in a small way, one of his sons on the floor of that house, watching the first scribe of divine knowledge fill page after page with a year plus one worth of heaven. So now we hit the haunting question this whole video has been orbiting around. If Enoch is sitting there with his 366 books, mapping out the heavens, and the structure of creation and Genesis is also telling a story about creation, light, firmaments, waters above and below, who is borrowing from whom? Did 2 Enoch really describe the heavens before Genesis ever named them, or is it the other way around? On the surface, the timeline looks simple. Genesis, at least in its core priestly creation layer, is usually dated by scholars to the exilic or early post-exilic period, somewhere around the 6th, 5th century BCE, drawing on older traditions. 2 Enoch, by contrast, shows up in Slavonic manuscripts more than 1,000 years later. And most specialists think the original work was composed in the late Second Temple period, maybe 1st century BCE to 1st century CE, possibly even a bit later. If you're just looking at manuscript evidence and literary style, the safe, boring answer is Genesis comes first. 2 Enoch comes after commenting on a world where Genesis already exists and is already sacred. You can see that in the way 2 Enoch moves. Its creation account is laid out as a sequence of days. It has a heaven and earth beginning, a structured ordering of waters, lights, plants, animals, human beings. It looks to a trained eye like it knows the Genesis pattern and is riffing on it, adding extra harmonies, hidden chords, bonus verses. It doesn't crash into Genesis and contradict it. It curls around it, fills in gaps, answers unasked questions. So, if we're talking about written canonical texts, the scholarly consensus is pretty clear. Genesis is earlier to Enoch is later. The mysterious Slavonic apocalypse is not secretly older than the Torah, but that isn't the whole story. Because once you step out of the library and back into the ancient Near Eastern world, you're not just dealing with books. You're dealing with oral traditions, priestly teaching, temple liturgies, cosmological scripts that existed in many slightly different forms long before anyone pinned them down in a single scroll. Some researchers argue that what 2 Enoch preserves isn't simply a late commentary on Genesis, but traces of older cosmological strands running parallel to Genesis, sometimes converging, sometimes wandering off in their own direction. The way it multiplies heavens, the way it structures days and times, the way it imagines storehouses of snow, treasuries of light, cosmic calendars that don't quite line up with the neat 7-day rhythm we're used to. Those bits don't obviously come from the priestly Genesis text. They feel like they belong to a wider imaginative ecosystem. That's where the counterargument lives. Maybe 2 Enoch is late as a book, but inside it are fossilized pieces of much older material. Chants, temple teachings, speculative priestly law that were circulating in Jewish circles for centuries, even millennia. Genesis captures one careful, streamlined version of creation for liturgical use. Enochic literature, including 2 Enoch, captures the wilder, more experimental edge of that same world. And both of them, Genesis and 2 Enoch alike, are dipping their cups into an even deeper well. When ancient Israelites talked about waters above and a solid dome of heaven, they weren't inventing that imagery in a vacuum. Mesopotamian texts like Enuma Elish, Ugaritic poems from Syria, Egyptian hymns to the sun god, all of them play with divided waters, layered skies, councils of divine beings, cosmic mountains, primeval seas. Genesis 1 domesticates that raw material into an austere liturgical poem. One God, 7 days, an orderly sequence. 2. Enoch spins it out in another direction. Multiple heavens, angelic engineers, storerooms of elemental forces, a detailed timetable of cosmic operations. They're not simply copies of each other. They're siblings in a much larger family of stories. So when we ask which came first to Enoch or Genesis, we might be asking the wrong kind of question, in terms of writing Genesis first to Enoch later. In terms of ideas, It's messier. Some motifs in 2 Enoch clearly depend on a world where Genesis already shapes how Jews talk about creation. Other motifs feel like they come from shared ancient Near Eastern stock that could be older than any surviving Bible text. And some may be genuinely innovative, the product of late Second Temple minds pushing old symbols into new configurations. A better question might be, what do these 2 texts share? And what does that tell us about how ancient people imagined the universe? Both agree that creation is structured, layered, intentional. Both assume a cosmos that isn't random, but ordered with set times, cycles, and boundaries. Both see humans as the target of that order, the ones who need calendars, laws, festivals, moral codes that align with the deep pattern of things. But 2 Enoch pulls back the curtain further. It doesn't just say God created. It says, here's the workshop. Here are the departments. Here are the angelic job descriptions. Here's how the calendar is wired. Why certain days carry more weight. How time itself has hidden seams. That's what the comparison really reveals. Ancient Judaism wasn't cosmologically flat. There wasn't just one way to tell the story of beginnings. There was the official liturgical temple-sized version we now call Genesis, and there were fringe visionary speculative versions whispered among scribes and mystics where Enoch walks through the rafters of the universe and writes 366 volumes about what he sees. Both streams fed into later Jewish and Christian thought. Both shaped how people imagined God, angels, heaven, and time. And both remind us that behind the clean lines of our modern Bible sits a swirling, contested, astonishingly diverse world of ancient cosmological imagination, where the question isn't only which text came first, but how many different ways humans tried to map a reality they were sure was bigger than anything they could write down. If 2 Enoch is drawing from the same deep well as Genesis, you might expect it to sit right alongside Genesis in the Bible. It talks about creation, heaven, angels, repentance, judgment. It praises the same God. Enoch is even a biblical character. So why did a text like this end up on the outside? Part of the answer is timing. By the time 2 Enoch was written, late Second Temple period. If most scholars are right, the core Jewish scriptures were already hardening. The Torah, the prophets, the big historical books, the major psalms and wisdom collections. Those were the backbone of communal life. New writings could still be loved, copied, revered, but they had to fit under the umbrella of what was already considered authoritative. Enochic literature in general lives right on that edge. 1 Enoch has a stronger claim in early Judaism. The Dead Sea Scrolls show it being copied and quoted. Some Jewish groups treated it as inspired. Even early Christians, like the author of Jude, seemed to know and use it. But even 1 Enoch never fully made it into the mainstream rabbinic canon. 2 Enoch is in a weaker position from the start. It was probably composed in Greek somewhere in the Jewish world of Egypt or the Levant, then translated into Slavonic centuries later. It doesn't show up among the scrolls at Qumran. It doesn't get cited by New Testament writers. When rabbinic Judaism consolidates after the destruction of the temple, 2 Enoch is simply not part of the conversation. And even if it had been on the table, a text like 2 Enoch is risky. It gives you a guided tour of the heavens, very specific angelic hierarchies, names, ranks, functions. It lets a human walk into the throne room, see God, and live. It hands you secret calendars, mystical measurements, hidden explanations of time and judgment. That's a recipe for uncontrolled speculation. The rabbis who shaped later Judaism were famously wary of this kind of thing. In the Talmud, there are warnings about expounding on the chariot of Ezekiel 1 and about probing what is above, what is below, what is before, what is after. Dive too deep into the secrets of creation and the heavenly throne, and you cross a line from piety into danger. 2 Enoch barrels right past that line. On the Christian side, something similar happens, but in a different key. Early church communities were also trying to stabilize a canon. They had inherited Israel's scriptures in Greek form, and they were sorting through a flood of new Gospels, Acts, Apocalypses, and letters. Texts were judged by apostolic connection, theological usefulness, and liturgical practicality. To Enoch had none of those advantages. No apostle's name, no obvious use in worship, no wide circulation in the Greek-speaking churches whose lists of approved books eventually won out. By the time Christian leaders are writing official canon lists in the 4th century, 2 Enoch barely registers as a rumor, if at all. And yet, the story doesn't end there, because while 2 Enoch disappears in the Rabbinic and Latin West, it quietly survives in a very specific corner of the Christian world, the Slavic Orthodox tradition. Somewhere around the early Middle Ages, a Greek text of 2 Enoch seems to have been translated into Old Church Slavonic, probably in a Byzantine context. From there it enters the literary world of Eastern Orthodox Slavs, Bulgarians, Serbs, Russians. In those circles, it isn't canon. It isn't read in church the way the Gospel of John or the Psalms are, but it isn't forgotten either. It sits on monastery shelves. It gets copied, adapted, sometimes Christianized more heavily with extra references to Christ, sometimes used as a mine for moral exhortation and homiletic material. Medieval Slavic preachers and compilers clearly found its visions and warnings powerful enough to preserve. So you end up with this strange situation in the Jewish world that probably birthed it. 2. Enoch vanishes. In the Greek and Latin Christian mainstream, it's barely known, but in Slavic Christianity, on the edges of Europe, it becomes part of a broader apocryphal ecosystem, a cluster of visionary texts about Adam, Eve, Enoch, Abraham, Isaiah, that shape how ordinary believers imagine heaven and the afterlife. That's one of the key ways apocryphal texts work. Even when they're not canonical, they leak into popular imagination. You might never have heard a priest say, "Thus says to Enoch," but you might hear sermons about 7 heavens, about storerooms of snow and hail held back until judgment, about angels running the elements like cosmic administrators, about Enoch as a scribe of heaven. Those details don't come from Genesis. They come from the wider apocalyptic and mystical archive, where 2 Enoch is a major player. In Judaism, something parallel happens, though not directly through 2 Enoch itself. Later mystical movements, Merkabah mysticism in the early centuries CE and later Kabbalah in the medieval period, start obsessing over the same kinds of themes that 2 Enoch loves: ascent through multiple heavens, detailed angelic hierarchies, throne visions, secret names, hidden structures of time and light. Merkabah texts describe visionary journeys through palaces of heaven, guarded by terrifying angels, leading up to a radiant, ineffable throne. Kabbalistic writings map the divine realm as layered emanations, sephiro, pathways of light and judgment. Do those movements quote to Enoch? Not really. They develop independently within Rabbinic Judaism centuries after 2 Enoch was first written. But many scholars suspect that they and 2 Enoch are cousins. All of them draw from a shared apocalyptic and priestly reservoir. Ezekiel's chariot, Isaiah's throne vision, Daniel's Ancient of Days, and a host of now lost Second Temple speculations about heavenly liturgies, angelic orders, and cosmic architecture. 2 Enoch happens to preserve one of the richest snapshots of that world. You could say 2 Enoch is like a missing bridge. On one side you have biblical visions, brief, concentrated, canonical. On the other side you have full-blown Jewish mysticism with intricate diagrams of heaven and daring techniques for approaching God's presence. 2. Enoch stands in the middle, a transitional fossil of the imagination, showing how temple piety could morph into mystical ascent. That's why modern scholars have come back to it with such intensity. For a long time, Western academics didn't even know 2 Enoch existed. The Slavonic manuscripts only became widely accessible in the 19th and 20th centuries. Since then, the text has been a magnet for debates. Is it originally Jewish or already Christian? Does it come from Alexandria or Palestine or somewhere else entirely? How early is it? How much priestly lore does it preserve? There's no final consensus. New manuscript discoveries and fresh analyses keep reshuffling the picture. But one thing has become clear. You can't really understand the landscape of Second Temple Judaism or the roots of later mysticism if you ignore this book. and beyond the historical questions to Enoch, still matters for a more basic reason. It shows us how ancient people thought about the universe when they weren't being liturgically polite. Genesis gives you a clean, careful public script to Enoch, gives you the backstage pass, layered heavens, cosmic calendars, angelic bureaucracy, a God whose transcendence is matched by an almost overwhelming nearness when Enoch finally stands before him. Studying that kind of text doesn't mean we have to accept its cosmology as literal. What it does is widen our field of vision. It reminds us that the biblical world wasn't populated by flat, abstract monotheists. It was full of people whose imaginations were on fire with questions about what lay above the sky, behind time, beneath ordinary experience. And, to Enoch, marginalized, non-canonical, half-forgotten, is one of the few places where that fire is allowed to burn in full view. Which brings us to one last question. If a book like this lived such a powerful underground life, what else might be hiding in the shadow of the canon, quietly reshaping how people picture God, angels, and the end of all things? We started this journey with a simple question. What kind of book claims to take you through multiple heavens, explain creation in a way that feels both familiar and alien next to Genesis, and turn a brief biblical ancestor into a cosmic scribe with 366 books of heavenly knowledge? 2. Enoch does all of that, and then some. We followed Enoch as he was taken up through layered heavens, past clouds and waters, past angelic storehouses of snow and hail, past paradisal gardens and places of punishment, through realms of sun and moon and star-keepers, all the way to archangels and the throne of God. Each level wasn't just scenery, it was theology mapped as architecture. Weather became a sign of divine administration. Celestial bodies became obedient servants. Angels became the living gears of a universe run like a temple. Then too, Enoch did something even bolder. It rewound the clock to talk about creation itself. Before Genesis ever says in the beginning, it laid out a sequence of days but with twists. A pre-existent heavenly realm, an eighth day, a cosmic calendar that seems to stretch beyond the tidy week most of us know. It introduced a fallen figure called Satan, not just as a vague tempter, but as a former prince of the angels whose rebellion becomes a kind of backstage explanation for evil and corruption in the world. None of this simply cancels Genesis. It runs alongside it at times. It sounds like a commentary written to explain what earlier scriptures leave unexplained. At other moments, it feels almost like a parallel version of the same theological world. One God, an ordered universe, moral judgment, yet expanded into an intricate hierarchy of heavens, ages, and supernatural beings. And strangely, despite all its detail, the text itself remains remarkably difficult to place. We cannot say with certainty when it was composed. Was it written during the late Second Temple period, in the early 1st century, or perhaps later, after substantial Christian reshaping? Scholars compare Jewish priestly traditions, Hellenistic influences, Christian additions, and Slavic transmission, arriving at theories that overlap without ever becoming identical. Its original home is equally uncertain. Egypt? Palestine? Perhaps another Jewish community somewhere in the diaspora. The evidence only offers clues, memories of the temple, heavenly angelic rituals, and repeated calls toward righteous living. We also cannot determine exactly how closely its creation account preserves older oral or written traditions that may have existed alongside Genesis. Perhaps it draws from earlier material, or perhaps it simply takes Genesis and expands its world through imagination, symbolism, and apocalyptic vision. But that uncertainty isn't necessarily a weakness. In many ways, it is what makes 2nd Enoch so fascinating. The text occupies a blurred boundary where memory, worship, imagination, and speculation constantly overlap. It captures ancient minds reaching upward toward the structure of heaven and backward toward the beginning of everything. How many levels does reality contain? Who governs them? When did they begin? And where did evil first enter? Its answers vary, and they were never the only possibilities. Yet they reveal how expansive ancient ideas about the universe could become. Some Jews and early Christians imagined 7, 10, or even more heavens. Others pictured angels as nothing more than messengers. Others, like the author of 2 Enoch, imagined them as managers of time, elements, and fate. Some were content with a tight spare creation story. Others wanted to stack on extra days, extra realms, extra explanations, until the cosmos looked like a vast humming machine of holiness. 2 Enoch is one of the clearest windows we have into that diversity. It shows that the world around Genesis was not a flat backdrop. It was a crowded, contested arena of ideas about how heaven and earth fit together. When you read 2 Enoch next to Genesis, you're not just comparing two texts. You're eavesdropping on a much larger, mostly lost conversation about God, angels, time, and the shape of the universe. And maybe that's the lasting power of a book like this. Even if we never solve the puzzle of its exact date, or nail down its original language beyond doubt, or fully reconstruct the community that first copied it to Enoch, keeps doing the same thing to modern readers that it did to ancient ones. It pushes the imagination outward. It reminds us that people who confessed one God did not stop at one neat picture of reality. They experimented, they argued, they dreamed. Thank you for listening to this presentation of Soft History Stories. We hope you enjoyed this journey. These stories have survived for thousands of years, reminding us of the power of love, the danger of pride, and the timeless truths that connect us all. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the stories that shaped our world.